So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to talk about protecting Montanans Health from coal plant toxins. A suite of rules came out within the last couple of weeks from the EPA that were really focused on reducing pollution from coal-fired power plants. We'll kind of give a brief overview of all of the rules, but we're really going to focus on the mercury and air toxics standards, the MATS rules, because they have the most immediate impacts for us here in Montana. And we're going to hear from Rob Byron at Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate. We're going to hear from Ann Hedges with MEIC. David Merrill with Sierra Club is here and sponsoring, and happy to hear from him if he wants to add anything. But I'll note that we've been working with a ton of partners on this particular issue. It could have a huge impact in Montana, both for our public health and air pollution. And there are some other implications that we'll talk about as well. So I don't want to spoil too much of it, so we will dive right in. Please put questions as you have them in the chat. We are hoping to talk for about 35 minutes, and then at the end of the call, have a lot of time to go through those questions, or if you want to stay on the call and workshop writing a letter to the editor or an opinion editorial, we'll have people here who can talk with you about that, because those are some of the best ways you can get involved with this particular issue. So I will turn it over to Rob.
Okay, let's go to the next.
Sorry, this one is Ann first. Sorry.
Yeah, Ann first.
So I'll be pretty brief on this one. Last Thursday, EPA came out with a suite of rules as anticipated, and they were all final rules. So EPA had asked for public input on all of these rules about a year ago. These rules have been in the works for years. EPA doesn't just craft a rule. EPA goes out and collects data from power plant owners to find out what their emissions are to water or air. And then it collects all that data over the course of years. And then it puts out a proposed rule. We all comment on it. It goes back, considers all the comments, and it comes out with a final rule. All that is a long way to say these rules have been in the works for a very long time. There is nothing surprising about any of these rules. So when industry says they feel like, they're under attack and they didn't see this coming, they're not being truthful. Everybody saw these rules coming, every single one of them. So let's start briefly with the greenhouse gas rule. That's the one that it's getting a lot of attention because it's the first time really that EPA is directly regulating greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel generating plants. And it really is a rule primarily focused on coal facilities. It has a very complex structure for gas facilities, mainly focusing on larger plants that operate more frequently. But what it does is it requires these facilities to update in the 30s. So plants that are going to, it gives the plants that are going to last longer an obligation to update their facility. If plants are slated for closure, they will not have to update their facilities. So EPA has set various dates based upon which, if the plant is intended to operate beyond that date, then they are going to have to comply with the rules that require something like carbon capture and sequestration. Just from a Colstrip perspective, this facility is going to require the plant to start installing technologies to control carbon dioxide and sequester it underground in about 2030, has to be up and running by 2032. And the reason that Colstrip has that date is because Colstrip does not have a closure date. So if by 2030 a plant has a closure date in the near term, then their obligation to comply with the rule changes. EPA has a number of provisions in here for reliability to make sure that when we're looking at closing a facility that or installing expensive pollution controls, that we're making sure the system remains reliable, the lights stay on. So EPA has a lot of language in these rules about how to make sure that reliability is a factor that is considered when there is a deadline for compliance. The greenhouse gas rule is pretty simple: carbon capture and sequestration by a certain date, depending on how long your operation is going to be maintained. And if it's a gas plant, it's based upon how much that gas plant operates. So they differentiate between types of gas plants. So combined cycle gas plants have slightly different standards than simple cycle gas plants. They have different deadlines for compliance. So the greenhouse gas rule is pretty complicated. EPA put a lot of back bends into it to try to accommodate the industry and make sure that this works for them. And it gave states some authority to give plants more time to come into compliance based upon a number of factors. The greenhouse gas rule is a really important rule for setting a marker out there by which we're going to start seeing some of these really polluting plants either have to start capturing their carbon dioxide and storing it or closing down. So good rule, but there's a lot of wiggle room within the rule as far as I'm concerned. But we're happy to have it. Coal ash rule. The coal ash rule is about legacy ponds. So as you've heard from us many times, the Colstrip plant has 3 large coal ash areas. There's the unit 1 and 2 coal ash areas, which have closed because those 2 units are now offline permanently. You have the 3 and 4 coal ash disposal units. Those are really big leaking ash ponds that have been leaking since they were built. And then you have plant side ash ponds. And what this coal ash rule really does is go after legacy ponds. So those ponds that are remaining after a plant is closed, it really only applies to units 1 and 2. It will require excavation of a number of coal ash ponds at Colstrip. And I think that the owners of the plant saw the writing on the wall. They have been working to move in that direction anyway. I don't think the coal ash rule is going to create huge problems. It will be more expensive for them, but it also is far more protective of water resources in an area where you have leaking coal ash ponds. So the coal ash rule is a really good step forward. It really doesn't apply, though, to existing generation units, only ones that are legacy, that are from units that are already closed. So we're happy about that. That's a good day for water quality. Mercury and air toxics is probably the most important rule from a public health perspective, in Montana at least. The mercury and air toxics rule deals with 2 things. It is a rule that was first adopted in 2012, and under the Clean Air Act passed by Congress in 1990, facilities that put out a lot of hazardous, harmful air pollution have to contain their emissions. They have to control their emissions. And the way that EPA does that is it collects data from every source in the nation. And it does this based upon the type of source. So refineries do this specific to refineries. And cement kilns do this specific to cement kilns. Their air emissions have to be specific for the type of operation it is. Coal plants have gotten a sweetheart deal for a very, very long time and have not had rigorous air toxic standards. Finally, in 2012, EPA finally adopted a mercury and air toxic standard to limit power plant emissions from coal-fired power plants. And those standards were okay, but Congress understood that technology improves over time. So the 1990 Clean Air Act required EPA to review the air toxics emissions standards for big types of facilities like coal and refineries and cement kilns every 8 years. So they update these rules every 8 years. For Colstrip or anybody to say they didn't see this coming, they didn't know that there was going to be an upgrade to the mercury and air toxic standard, they either have terrible lawyers or they're lying, because it is absolutely in the Clean Air Act. It is a component of the Clean Air Act that they update these standards every 8 years to force technology forward to protect public health. So mercury and air toxic standard, EPA only dealt with mercury really from lignite plants. Montana does not have any lignite burning plants, but we do have plants that release a lot of air toxics. So the mercury and air toxic standard, for this rule that just came out, for Montana's purposes, it really just addresses the toxic air emissions like lead and arsenic and selenium and all sorts of other harmful, toxic to human substances that coal plants are notorious for putting into our air. EPA did a very, very thorough job of developing this rule, of taking public comment and designing it to try to drive technology in a way where most facilities are already in compliance. The vast majority of coal-fired power plants that exist today already comply with the standard that EPA set. So the standard EPA set is nothing revolutionary, it's nothing radical. It is a standard based upon what most of the units in this country are already achieving. The emission levels for arsenic and lead that other plants in the country are already limiting their emissions of those toxic substances. Colstrip is not, and therefore Colstrip very much is a problem child when it comes to the MATS rule. They have very high emission rates. And then the final rule that was released last Thursday is the water discharge rule. And this rule doesn't apply to Colstrip because they do not have a water discharge permit, even though they've been polluting the groundwater and surface water for decades. They don't technically have a water discharge permit, so this rule does not apply to them. So those are the 4 big rules that came out, and we're going to focus on MATS. Rob, do you want to take this one or do you want me to? Okay. So just to EPA, when it collected data, it went out and it asked every power plant in the country, every coal-fired power plant, to give them their emissions for harmful air pollution. And they wanted their emissions from 2017 to 2020. All of the plants sent their data to EPA. EPA consolidated that data. It put out a report that shows what emissions are all over the country for every unit in the nation. And Colstrip Unit 4 releases the highest rate of filterable particulate emissions of any coal plant in the country. And now you might say, why filterable particulate emissions? Well, these power plants don't measure directly lead or arsenic or mercury. They do mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, all these non-mercury heavy metals. They don't measure those directly. What they do is there is a calculation saying for every particulate, or the amount of particulate you put out, a certain percentage of that are these harmful air emissions, these arsenic and lead emissions. So EPA does a calculation and says, if you put this much volume of particulate into the air, that particulate contains lead and arsenic in these percentages. And so what they do is they measure filterable particulate limits or levels. And when they want to improve air quality, they lower those filterable particulate levels. They require facilities to install equipment to limit the filterable particulate emissions. So that is what the EPA has done in this rule. It has said you're going to have to limit filterable particulates. That's how they measure it. They measure it once a quarter. The plant does. The plant owners measure their filterable particulates once a quarter to verify that they're under the limit. And like in 2018, when there's testing and repeated testing came to the end of the quarter, they still couldn't comply. And that unit 3 and 4 were offline for almost an entire summer because they could not meet the old filterable particulate limit for toxic air pollution. And I'm happy to clarify that. It's a little confusing, but ultimately particulates are just a surrogate for arsenic and lead. So unit 4 has the highest emission rate in the nation. The next closest is 50% lower than Colstrip. So unit 4 is being looked at as a real outlier all over the country as having super harmful air quality pollution. Unit 3 is number 3 on that list. So Colstrip unit 4 and unit 3 are number 1 and number 3 for highest emission rates of toxic air pollution in the nation, as measured through filterable particulate emissions. So that's why we're here today talking about this.
Okay. So why do we care? Or maybe a little bit of perspective on it. This is the data from EPA of the amount of hazardous air pollution released from Colstrip from 2012 to 2022. So 3.5 tons or 3.3 tons of lead, 1.5 tons of arsenic, 14 tons of manganese, and a lot of nickel, selenium, and chromium as well. Now, specifically, and just to emphasize what Ann said, we're not talking a lot about mercury today because Colstrip has been reducing or filtering out their mercury emissions. So that's why the MATS rule doesn't affect them a whole lot in the mercury component, but it does in the air toxics. Next slide. So again, why do we care about these? Why are they toxic? Well, arsenic, I suspect most folks know and have heard of it, is extremely toxic in the body. When we get it in by inhalation, it's have higher risk of lung and kidney cancer. There are developmental effects, diabetes, and lung and cardiovascular disease from ingestion. And particularly concerning are the fetal and early childhood impacts, which studies have shown it's associated with increased mortality from cancer, lung, and heart disease. And again, just to emphasize, it's bad if somebody, say my age or in the adult, dies from something that they didn't have to. But it's even much worse when a child is affected by something, especially before they're born, because now they have to live with that all of their lives, and it doesn't go away. They don't get better from that if they've already been impacted early in life. Lead, I think we've learned a lot about that. This actually is one of the biggest public health successes in the US, having done away with most places, lead paint and others. But we've also found out that, and we've learned places like Flint, Michigan, from the lead pipes from the waters, a lot of people had lead toxicity. It's still a big issue in many places, but one of the biggest sources remaining is emissions from particularly power plants and burning of coal. Lead has huge cognitive effects and both developmental for children that they live with all their lives, everything from learning disabilities to much more prominent cognitive effects, but also growth effects. We've seen damages to the heart, kidney, brain, and reproductive systems in both young adults and adults. Next slide. And this just points out for 2 levels. This shows annual emissions of arsenic and lead from Colstrip, starting in about 2013. Now, if you'll note, the flat green line at the bottom of this graph is the acceptable levels. In other words, there is no safe level exposure to either one of these. Let's go back. Thank you. You'll also notice that the emissions went down pretty dramatically along about 2019, which was the COVID epidemic. But also notice that's also when we shut down units 1 and 2. But you'll also look that since the COVID epidemic is over, the emissions are going back up. Okay, next slide. Okay, how about the others, which we don't hear as much about? For example, chromium. Chromium's certainly an upper airway irritant, and in high levels can cause what's called metal fume fever. These levels are much higher than you would expect people to get, and this is usually from an acute or an immediate exposure. But over the long term, it can induce allergies and asthma, and is also a skin irritant. Manganese, long-term exposure has neurological effects and can induce a disease that's very much like Parkinson's disease. Nickel can cause lung fibrosis, heart disease, kidney disease, and also has been associated with some cancers. And selenium, well, again, long-term exposure, little less known about it, but certainly fatigue and a lot of effects on the skin system and also the GI system as well. Next slide. And this is the one we looked at before. So consider the numbers of these, of tons of air pollutions that are being emitted. I mean, certainly in any one day or any 1 hour, not a lot's emitted, but these plants function 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, unless they're shut down for other reasons. So the total amount of air pollutants that they emit is huge. And that's the issue when we're talking about things like this. Next one. Okay, back to Anne.
I've already given a lot of the background on Matt, so very quickly, just because I've heard this argument that they didn't know this was going to happen, they didn't, they feel like they've been blindsided, when in fact, the first mercury and air toxic standard in the nation was in 2012. EPA started collecting the emissions in 2020. The emissions data, and it's the plants are reporting this emission data. They knew why EPA was collecting this emission data. EPA had to tell them why they were collecting this emission data. They put out a public draft for comment and review last year, about a year ago. They gave them months of public comments, closed at the end of June. There's nothing new or surprising about this rule. Next slide. So the new standard, the new rule is a company has 3 years to install the equipment to begin operating it and start complying with this new rule. So the idea is toxic air pollution is really harmful to public health, and Congress set a requirement. This is Congress, this is not EPA. Congress set an obligation for anyone who is putting out high volumes of toxic air pollution to comply with a new EPA standard within 3 years, with an option for like a 1-year extension if there's something beyond their control and they cannot get the equipment. So this is not EPA being radical. This is an obligation Congress gave to EPA in 1990. So the idea, again, that these owners didn't know this was coming is just a bunch of malarkey. So the 2024 rule, Colstrip, its highest emission rate during the period of time in which it reported to EPA was 0.27. The new standard is 0.10. So it's nearly 3 times, its highest emission rate is nearly 3 times the standard that EPA now says is safe. But it's not just what EPA says is safe, it's what EPA has determined that most of the plants in the country are already achieving. The standard is called maximum achievable control technology, based upon what other facilities in the nation are achieving. They are, a lot of facilities, most of them are achieving this emission rate or can do very little to change their system to achieve this emission rate. Colstrip is nearly 3 times that emission rate because they have not installed the technology that these other facilities have installed to control their particulate emissions. So Colstrip Unit 4, like I said, super high. Colstrip Unit 3, also super high. And this new rule has a really great thing in it. It's called a continuous emission monitor. So right now, the way that the companies go and measure is once a quarter, they go take 3 tests. They're in charge of those tests. They have to follow certain rules for taking the test, but they are in charge of when they take the test. They're the ones who are responsible for submitting that data to the agency. The companies have total control over these 3 tests they do once a quarter to prove compliance. But there are continuous emissions monitors available. These are monitors that you put on the stack that can tell you every minute of every day what their emissions are. This is really, really important. In fact, Colstrip already has a continuous emission monitor on its stacks as a result of some litigation we filed years ago and settled with them to put those monitors on the stack, but they refuse to use them for compliance purposes. So you cannot say you're violating the law based upon their continuous emission monitors now. This rule changes that. It says you have to have these monitors up and running. Okay, we already have those at Colstrip, and you actually have to comply with them. And if you don't, then you are subject to an enforcement action. So that continuous emission monitor is a really important piece of accountability for these power plants. Next slide. This is a graph that EPA has in one of the documents that I put out last year showing what everybody's emission rates are. And so you can see that generally, this is a statistical measurement, shows you where basically everybody falls, and they all fall within the arrow that Katie is showing. The X is Colstrip. We are such an outlier that we got our own color, we got our own symbol, and we are at the very top of the graph because we are such an outlier all over the country for hazardous air pollutants. Just take that in. I think that slide tells a lot about the problem that we have in Montana. Next slide. So the MATS rule is a final rule. It goes into effect as soon as it is published in the Federal Register. From that point in time, the companies have 3 years to install the technology and operate it to control these emissions. We know that technology exists. We know that the Colstrip plant has something called a wet scrubber, which is all they have, where every other coal plant in the nation that has a wet scrubber already has installed either a fabric filter bag house or an electrostatic precipitator. Those are the 2 pieces of equipment you generally use to control particulates. Every facility that has the same technology as Colstrip has already installed this technology. Colstrip hasn't. They are decades behind the times, and they've gotten away with it. And they shouldn't be able to get away with it any longer and harm people's health. So we are very happy that public health is finally going to be protected from this super polluter. Next. And the plant owners, they have a choice. They've had a choice forever. All these other facilities, including the little Hardin generating station outside of Hardin, it's only a 100 megawatt plant, but when they built that plant in 2006, they installed a fabric filter bag house. That plant has the technology that we are asking Colstrip to install. And we're doing it because of public health. We're doing it because people shouldn't suffer because the owners of this facility have failed to upgrade the plant as every other owner of every other facility in this nation has already done. So we want the same health protections as everybody else. And the owners are saying this rule is going to close the plant. And I think we need to be really clear that it is their choice about what the future holds. They could have gone and installed this technology years ago, like everybody else did. They could still install this technology. They could go to their utility commissions and they could ask their utility commissions to pass those costs off to customers. They have so many options. They've had options for a very long time, and they have not exercised those options. They have said, we're not going to do anything, and we're going to sit back and know we're going to get mad if anybody tells us that we actually have to protect the public from all the harmful things that Dr. Byron just mentioned. So everybody else has managed to do it. Why can't we? That is the choice that the plant owners have, and it is nobody else's fault except their own. And Katie, is there another slide after this one? Because I just want to say, this is the way they're going about business is so unfair to the workforce. It's so unfair to the communities. Oh, Brian Bird, this is our new CEO of Northwestern Energy. And this is just the most absurd, ridiculous, outrageous statement I've heard Northwestern make in a really long time. On-demand generation from natural gas and coal power is critical for reliable and affordable power. Well, not really. Lots of people are finding ways to have a reliable and affordable power, and they're moving away from fossil fuels. But anyway, he says that. in all weather conditions. Well, remember, half of Colstrip was down when it was super cold in Montana in January. So yeah, we need reliable power in all weather conditions, and coal is not terribly reliable sometimes. Okay, moving on to the rest of his statement, which is the really absurd part. The EPA's decision include timelines and unproven technology. Unproven technology. So baghouses and ESPs have been in use by various industrial entities since the 70s. This is not unproven technology. It is actually proven technology that is extremely effective at protecting public health. This guy needs to go find another job. That's what I say. If he is so callous about public health and he doesn't even know that a fabric filter baghouse has been around for generations, then I'm not sure that we should trust him with a coal plant that has this type of emission. Okay, next slide. So what is the future? The future is going to be different than the past. The future is either these guys invest in the facility or they start thinking about what the next step is, just like every other big, mature utility in the country. So as utilities think about what their future looks like, we have asked time and time again, and all of you have too, we've asked Northwestern to plan for a future without Colstrip. What would that look like? Do your integrated resource plan and do some scenarios without Colstrip and be honest about it. Look at what the options are. And instead, they didn't do it for years. They finally did it. They did a lousy job of it because they don't want to look at a different future. But what the problem with that is, it's the workforce. It's the fact that you have an amazing wind resource in that area. It is the fact that you have a transmission system leaving Colstrip and going to West Coast markets that is the gold standard. It takes a decade to build a transmission line like that right now. That's if you're lucky. We have that transmission system, and we have the ability to keep workers doing reclamation, remediation, building wind turbines, operating those wind turbines, and all sorts of other types of energy generation potential exists in that area. They could look to that. They could keep people employed. They could make sure that our energy future is guaranteed to be reliable and affordable and just for those people who live downwind and who work at this plant. That's what our utility, that's what its obligation should be. And instead, it's been taking shortcuts for so long that it doesn't even know what the right path is anymore. And we absolutely don't have a public service commission that's going to make them do this. So as Montanans and as the workforce out there and as people who live downwind, we all deserve better. There are so many options available. There's a lot of opportunity here. But if we just say we don't want to do anything because it's too expensive, then you are going to make sure, they are going to make sure that people suffer as a result of this outlier coal plant that is upwind from a lot of people. So there are so many choices available to us. There's so many opportunities. And we should have been taking those opportunities when the first MATS rule came out in 2012. And instead, we have a utility that has been resisting even thinking about this for over a decade. And that's just unacceptable. And the time is now.
Right.
I'm going to turn it over to Katie and David.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks. So what can you do? Anne already talked about how the rule is final, but there are some potentialities where our Congress can make changes or even prevent them from going fully into effect. So there are some things that you can do to help. The first thing is to stay engaged with organizations like ours. So being at this webinar is a great first start because this is a complicated topic and it can get really hard to get the technical details right. So stay in touch with us. Let us know if you have questions. Like, we're here for you on these topics. The next thing is that there is a petition that our groups have put together to our congressional delegation. I'll put it in the chat. Please sign it and share it. We want to send it to all 4 of them and let them know, like, Montanans care about public health, and MATS is a public health rule and it should be supported. So you can sign that. There's a link in the chat, and I'm sure our groups will be sharing it all sorts of different places on our social media pages and our email lists, etc. And then the next thing that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about is writing an opinion piece and submitting it to your local paper. I definitely recognize some names of our participants tonight as common writers of opinion pieces. So if I miss anything, you can definitely chime in with some of your best practices. So this is intended to be a little bit of a workshop section. So if you do have questions about the rules, please put them in the chat. We're going to have some time at the end to get to them. But also, if you want to stay online and hang out with me and start to write an opinion piece and just get something going, that's sometimes the hardest part, is just getting started. So yeah, this is intended to be a bit of a workshop section. So the first thing I wanted to do is briefly talk about the difference between a letter to the editor and an opinion editorial. Letters to the editor are smaller, they're shorter, usually with a word limit of about 200 to 300 words. It does vary by paper, so just be sure to check. You typically want to submit your LTEs to a newspaper in your own community. They often will not print letters to the editor from people who do not live in the community. So as somebody who lives in Missoula, if I tried to submit an LTE to the Billings Gazette, it probably would not get accepted, which makes sense because LTEs are the strongest when they come from a neighborly voice. They're intended for people in your community to talk to other people in community about something you care about. So that's a really important part. And just as a practical note, papers get a lot of LTEs, so they have a chance of being published in the physical paper, but it seems likely these days that most LTEs that get submitted, if they're in any form readable, will get published online. So have some faith in that what you write will most likely get published, at least online. Opinion editorials, or op-eds, are longer. In Montana, I've seen word limits for these of starting at 600 words, but up to 700 or 800. Again, you just want to check. Sometimes if they're too long and the editors are busy, they might not tell you why they've rejected your piece, and it could just be that it's too long. So it's easy to check. And they're generally longer. They generally come from people with some kind of expertise or qualification or standing in the issue area they're addressing. So for MATS, for example, like if you're a healthcare provider, that's a really great position to take or to come into with a piece like this. If you live in the vicinity, if you know people who've been affected by the issue, or you are a person who's been affected, those are really strong experiences that can come through in an op-ed. That said, they are generally less likely to be published in print papers because they're longer and editors get a lot of different op-ed submissions. So thinking about things like timing is important. Writing an op-ed about something that's timely makes it more likely to be published because it ties in with some news that's happening. So right now, MATS is a very timely issue, and there will be more likely to be printed because this is an ongoing issue that we are continuing to see in the news cycle. I'm just going to check the chat and make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. So just very quickly, how to write an LTE. You have a really brief space. So you kind of want to consider a few things. Kind of consider your flow. Consider a call to action. Are you trying to get your neighbors to pay attention? Are you trying to get them to sign this petition that I put in the chat? Are you trying to get them to care or take some other kind of action? You either want to start or end the piece, but you don't want to do both because you have such little space in your LTE. You want to write what you know. Authenticity is really important when you're writing an LTE because that's how you connect with people. That's how you get that neighborly connection when people can feel you're being genuine with them. Your personal knowledge and experience is more likely to be engaging than overgeneralizations. So it's easy to say that air pollution is bad. It's more interesting and truthful to share an experience that you've had with air pollution that impacted your life. And then I think most newspapers in the state have forms now online where they'll ask for your name and your address. Some papers are starting to ask for more personal information like your age range. I think they're just trying to prevent people from other communities or bots from submitting things. So hopefully that doesn't weird you out too much when you're submitting your LTE. For an op-ed, my favorite thing is to give your op-ed a bold title, something that really catches the reader's attention. You know immediately what the op-ed is going to be about. Usually I like to do something challenging. I have a few examples on the next slide that we'll get to. But maybe, yeah, we'll talk more about that. So as you're writing the op-ed, try to open with something catchy and then refer back to it in the closer. It's just a really simple writing technique that editors and journalists love because it gives the piece symmetry and a little bit more polish. I like to usually open with a hypothetical or an analogy. I really love using analogies just because it can help make a complicated topic more understandable for the people reading it. And then you want to use specific personal examples and knowledge. So that's how you show, don't tell. You can say, again, how bad air pollution is, but if you can give those personal examples and weave some facts in there, that's going to stick with readers a lot more than just saying over and over again how bad air pollution is. And then just again, consider what's relevant and timely and newsworthy. I also think just a bit controversial is much more likely to get published because it increases the chance that somebody's going to write an op-ed to respond to your op-ed. And also responding to someone else's op-ed can help yours get published. Newspapers like that kind of, back and forth debate. And I think it just increases the chance that it'll keep that engagement going. People get invested in stuff like that. So I think it's a good strategy. And then with 600 to 700 words, you have space to get detailed and specific. So do that. And then these are just some of my favorite titles. A lot of these are ones we worked on, and then some were from our partners. But this one in the top left is a challenge. Show us how you'll get to net zero Northwestern. We wrote one on an open cut mining law that turned into a monster and used an analogy that it's up here on the right, that the open cut mining law turned into Frankenstein's monster and Representative Steve Gunderson was Dr. Frankenstein. That one was really fun. Questions. Montana won't get fooled again, or will it? Fooled again on what? What did we get fooled on? What shouldn't we get fooled on now? Questions can be good, but you want to use them very sparingly. Callbacks to other cultural things. The carbon collar is a really well-known topic in Montana, concept in Montana. So pulling that in is helpful to get people's interest. So those are just some fun ways you can use bold titles to draw people in and kind of help define the direction of your op-ed. And then when you're ready to submit, we have a lot of links and emails on our resources page that I'll put in the chat in just a second. It's really helpful. It has all of these tips on it, and then it has a lot of the publications in the state, the major publications at least. And then if you notice anything that I'm missing here, please always let me know, because I want to try to keep this resources page up to date. And then this concludes the learning part of our webinar. We do have time for questions if people have questions. David, is there anything that you wanted to add? I kind of rolled
you
through
covered
that.
it, Katie. You covered it.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
No problem.
So yeah, so we have time for your questions. I'll hang out until the top of the hour if people want to stay on and work on LTEs or op-eds. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is a really important topic, and we're really excited about the potential of it for Montana, for both our public health implications and lots of other things. So that's all I had.
Okay. Katie, and if I could jump in, Ann said it many, many times, but I also want to emphasize that all of the EPA rules are based on public health evidence, scientific evidence. They are not about control or anything like that. So That's the requirement, that they be based on that, and they are to save lives. I emphasize that because almost nothing in the press since these rules were finalized last week mentions that. Not from most of our politicians, not from most of the business community. There's almost no mention of the fact that these rules, and particularly the MATS one, is about saving lives, plain and simple.
Spot on. That's why I think getting some LTEs and op-eds out there from folks is a way to introduce that in and remind the media that there's something they're missing here, and our politicians. So yeah, like I said, open for questions, and if you want to hang out and work on op-eds or something, you can put that in the chat and we can just go from there. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you. And we really do need your help in lifting this one up and making sure that the people of the state understand this is about health. It's not about the utilities. It's not about the workforce. Best thing we can do for the workforce is make sure this utility isn't harming people and has a plan for diversifying and keeping the lights on.